they're like, it's called a company bay.
Jillian and I like extroverts. They will everyone.
You gotta get so yeah.
And you're so much fun inside.
I have to get on my flight.
Wall decoration.
We have a wall here.
You're pregnant. Yeah, no, actually, I never got a flight to Johannesburg, and then on Monday I went to
Yes. I probably would have get pictures. And I
But yeah,
it is embarrassment because I met him more than once. We sat together and recited or something. And I say, I was thinking,
who you with?
well, you know,
Well, good morning, everyone. I see it's 11 o'clock, so we should probably go ahead and get started. Welcome, those of you here in the room, and also those of you joining us online. I'm really delighted that you're here. We are so in for a treat this morning. We're going to delve into some deep thinking about parenting, or in my case, grandparenting, which I'm really blessed to say. I am Patricia Hershberger, and I am a member of the Adult Faith Formation Committee, and I'll be your moderator today. Before I introduce Dr. Alison Miller, just a few housekeeping things. This recording is taking place live, and it will also be recorded. So for that reason, if you do have questions or comments, I will be passing around the microphone just so we can capture your comments and questions accurately for the recording. Also, this session is slated, welcome. This session is slated for about an hour, but if you do need to leave early, please feel free to slip out quietly. So with that, hold on one second. Yeah, sorry about that. I just have a short introduction about Dr. Miller. I could go on for a long time, but just a few things to get us started. She is a developmental psychologist and professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan. Dr. Miller is joining us to discuss findings from her decades of research that examines how individual children's factors, social relationships, and contextual processes shape healthy development for children. Aspects of her recent work involve trauma-informed care and best practices for communication with children. So with that, please help me give a nice warm welcome to Dr. Miller.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you all. It's really nice to be here. Is this mic on? All right, fabulous. So I also want to just say anything people are interested in and have questions about, I'm happy to talk about. And so I teach over in public health a class about child health and development to master's students, undergraduate students, PhD students who have a wide range of experience or sometimes no experience in thinking about kids and families. And that class is really geared toward how do we support kids and families? How do we help, message for kids and families? And so there's a wide range of topics that come up in that class, and everything from sleep, social media, physical activity, eating, like all these sort of hot button topics. And so I've kind of pulled in a few, but I'm happy to roam depending on what people are interested in talking about. So that's with that preface, and thank you, Patricia, for the introduction. So the other thing I thought I would just say in terms of goals for today, I wanted to kind of frame where we sit. It's a little bit of a challenging time, and so I think it's important to think about kind of broadly what issues children are facing and families in sort of today's world. And then really tried to go through some guidelines about how to talk with kids about hard topics, hard personal topics, hard big picture topics across age, because I'm a developmental scientist, so I'm always talking about different ages of kids. And then also share some examples and materials, and we can critique them and give feedback, and also as resources. So like I said, questions and discussion are absolutely welcome. And I will also keep my phone up here so I can look at time. Oh yeah, and there's time there. That's good. That's better, because I don't want my phone to go flying. I gesticulate. And so I guess the other thing I'll say, just as a framing note, is that I am always talking about children and stress and families and all the kind of bad things that are going on. And so I will do some of that here, but I also am trying to be really intentional about thinking about our strengths as communities, as families, as grandparents, as caregivers of any kind, or anyone who sort of has the opportunity to interact with children and families, and thinking about how we can kind of use some of these principles to be supportive. So, but I will start with the stress today, just because it's so salient and important. And so some of the big picture things that we in public health often call structural factors, things like poverty, racism, these things really shape how children live today. And in Michigan and nationwide, about 1 in 5, 1 in 4, if you're talking about young children and families, are living in poverty. So really at the poverty line, young children are really experiencing food insecurity, housing insecurity and instability, a lot of stress and trauma. And importantly, a lot of the programs that we are reliant on for helping children and families through this are sort of in jeopardy as we speak. And so that's a really important frame. The reason I note that young children and families are at often in higher rates of poverty, is that, of course, younger families are like starting out in their careers, starting out in their jobs. They don't have sort of a long-term career sometimes that they can rely on extra money, so they're not bringing in as much money, as well as if those of us who've had babies and toddlers can reflect and remember that's a really expensive time of life, both in terms of things you need to buy, like diapers, formula, baby things that they grow out of quickly, and you need to buy the new baby things, right? Also, the kind of family cost to having a young infant often means that often the female in the relationship who's had an infant is not working for a while. Maybe that's paid time off, maybe not. So there's all sorts of financial hits that young families in particular take. Okay. As well, there are factors that are influencing, sort of how kids and families are going. We've heard a lot about immigration and ICE raids in the news. One of our colleagues over at the School of Public Health, Bill Lopez, this is his first book about kind of family separation. He has another one that's called Raiding the Heartland. He's on a book tour right now, so it's a little plug. But one of the things that he writes about in Raiding the Heartland are all of these amazing stories of communities coming together, actually often at churches, to kind of be a meeting point, be a gathering point for families who are being, in a really challenging situation. So that's a particular stressor. Also for older youth, I've been talking about young kids and families, but older youth, we know that for kids who are LGBTQ, one of the most common reasons for homelessness is that these youth don't feel welcome in their homes and are kind of running away, and that's a large reason for sort of teen homelessness. I'm sorry, I know this is like really stressful. So the other, news cycles, right? So often, and I think this is something that comes up when talking with parents and caregivers of younger children, there's a perception that younger children are not really noticing things, but I would argue young children are very much noticing things. And we've seen this in our research when we're talking with, young children, and by that I mean sort of 2 to 5-year-olds, about things that are happening in the world. So they do take in this information. They do take in this sort of vicarious stress that we're also taking in through the media. And then, of course, things that are of concern in general, sort of our epidemic of isolation and loneliness. I'm happy to talk about social media, and I know that that's can be a challenging one to talk about and to think about how do we manage this new developmental context for youth. And then, of course, the other thing I always like to point out, and I don't know if anybody's read that book, The Stolen Year, but it's a really good one, and it's all about COVID and kind of what was happening during COVID, and it's by a journalist, and she followed different families. And frankly, I read it, I always do a lot of reading in the summer for my class, and I read it, I think last summer, and it already felt like history to me, because it was sort of like, this thing is unfolding, what's going to happen? This family did this family did this, and it was very profound to think, okay, we're 5 years out, but we are really still seeing sort of the tip of the iceberg in terms of a lot of the impacts on children and families. So I'd recommend that. And then the other thing, we talked about a lot of things. A lot of these things affect all kids, and a lot of them affect some kids more than others, right? So these things are not equally distributed in our population. That's how a public health person talks about that. And why we care is that young children in particular, but all children, are really impacted by their environment. So this is sort of that process by which we talk about stress getting under the skin. So even that vicarious seeing things about fires in California. I'm from California, so fires in California always like set me on edge, right? These are the things that are happening out there in the environment. They kind of can come into child development. And really this is where sort of my years of research have been in this sort of linking between stress and child outcomes and family factors that can support better outcomes for kids, particularly who are facing these stressors. And so if we think about kind of intervention factors, where might we intervene to, for example, support parents who don't have a lot of social support? Where can we sort of build in better social supports for maybe new, young, lonely parents? At kind of a policy level, can we, promote housing, resources, and that kind of thing? And so I like to kind of just lay this out. The other thing in getting to thinking about how we talk with children is that we know that when kids experience these sort of negative life events, adverse childhood events, this ACEs terminology has sort of been taking off recently, we know that it actually can impact adult health. And I often talk about the fact in my class that this research really got on the radar in the 90s when they linked early adverse childhood events, so like stress, trauma, things that happened prior to age 18, to adult coronary outcomes. And so I said, when things affect adult heart health, that's when people pay attention, right? So people started paying a little more attention to the welfare of kids because of these findings. Okay. And so the impacts, and this is getting to sort of how we can engage. Kids can be scared, sad, confused, worry about safety. They can also be angry and act out. So I don't know if anybody's had that experience when you know something's bothering a kid and something's brewing there, and all they're doing is kind of behaving badly, right? And being annoying, just being whatever it is, being needy, being, aggressive. And often that's coming from these other feelings that are hard to kind of get in and talk about. So we talk a lot about that with teachers. I don't know if any teachers are in the room, but that's certainly something that teachers think about. And then again, over time, these are kinds of things that happen for kids who are experiencing all the stressors. And then this is kind of where we come in as kind of caregivers and people in the child's bigger environment who might want to be able to support the child and the family, is that we know that how these stressors are handled can actually shape child development, kind of for better or for worse. So there's a lot of deep literature on this, but just thinking about, the idea of bad things happen for everyone, right? Bad things happen in our society. We all need to sort of figure out coping skills for those that work for us. And then particularly kids who have had, specific bad things like additional trauma or abuse, even kids who have had those experiences, when they get the care they need, they, have positive life outcomes. Okay, so how can we help children manage? I've mentioned families already, but children are embedded in families, and so that's one of the really important things. It's sort of one of those well, of course they are, right? But it also means that when we're talking about how to help children, we also have to help the adults that are around the children. And sometimes that's a harder argument to make. It's easy to say like, oh, help the young children, but sometimes those children have parents that maybe are making decisions we don't think are optimal, right? And so that's sort of a harder ask sometimes. So we have to learn about how to communicate well with families, because they're a key protective mechanism for kids, and also can pose risk. And then the other piece is that development can complicate some of these discussions. So when we're thinking about younger children, like preschoolers, what can they understand? What might they be going through? How can we think about talking with preschoolers compared to teens? What's helpful for kids to know, like at the moment, and what maybe we don't need to sort of overshare with kids, and that we may want to wait for them to ask us about what they know, what they want to know. The other things about that, and I'll talk about this a little more, but really in terms of thinking about child development very specifically, if we think about how children develop cognitively, they really aren't able to kind of project into the future and understand sort of future-oriented things till about like mid-elementary school, like 9 or 10-year-olds. And so when we're thinking about how to sort of talk about hard things, shape their response to stress or trauma, one of the things to think about is like, is this sort of a now issue that I'm helping the child work through, or are they kind of projecting into the future and worrying more about something? So if you have like an 11-year-old that's worrying about something, right? We see a lot of mental health concerns become documented in kids when they're like 11, 12, now even younger. But that's part of why, is that they're cognitively developing enough so that they can project into the future and worry about the future and also understand about the future. So that's kind of a good, like, just not total cut point. Kids vary, of course, by age, but that's a rough age marker for that idea of future orientation. Okay. And so one of the things that I talk about all the time is that relational health is a really positive protective factor for kids. And what I mean by that is that kids can have relational health across multiple members of their community, and the kids that are really the best off, that have the most protective factors, are the kids who have multiple relationships in their community. So obviously parents, primary caregivers, but also grandparents, also community members, neighbors. So kids who have, a relationship with multiple members of the community that is safe, trusting, consistent, that's the number one protective factor for child development. And we know that it also starts in infancy, and this is really how kids sort of learn the basics of communication, as well as social and emotional and cognitive skills. Have people heard about this term, serve and return interactions? Oh, good. It's one of my favorite things. And I like to check in because, like, sometimes things kind of filter through and sometimes they don't. So serve and return, it's like tennis, or pickleball. But basically it's the idea that, the baby's doing something and the caregiver responds, and then the baby responds, right? It's pretty simple. But it's very profound also because the baby is learning, I have a causal effect on my environment, right? Like I go, ah, and the caregiver goes, oh, and you have this conversation that can start between baby and caregiver. And it's really these very early interactions, right? We think about these, we've all sort of seen, I'm like a baby watcher, so I'll like go on the, train or something and I like look at babies interacting with their caregivers. But, we can all reflect on these moments that you've observed, right? And so what's really powerful is that there have been multiple studies where they actually require or have the caregiver sort of stop interacting with the baby at a certain point, like for 30 seconds. And the baby will just keep going and like, why is this caregiver not responding to me? Why are they not responding to me? And it's really a dramatic effect. It's called the still face effect. One of the things that I like to illustrate is that we all are kind of doing a little still face effect to others when we're looking at our phones. I know phones are ubiquitous, we can talk more about phones, but I like to link that because they've actually done also some studies, and some of this work is stuff that I do with some pediatric colleagues, looking at what happens to babies when their caregiver is doing something that may be really important and necessary on their phone, right? I am not saying that it's lifelong damage to babies, right? Babies also need to be able to wait and develop coping skills when their caregiver's not immediately available. But we see this effect, right? Babies want that interaction. So we have done some studies where we've kind of tested like a parent looking away, a parent looking at a phone, a baby looking at a tablet, a baby looking at a book. We've kind of varied all these different stimuli, and it's even babies, and those of us who've interacted with babies and tablets, like tablets, phones, they're made for our attentional, that's their currency, right? It's very hard to look away. So even for babies, even for us. So serve and return interactions. The key thing too that emerges from these serve and return interactions is early relational health. So this idea that these serve and return interactions develop this relationship that means that the baby, in a trusting, positive early relational health relationship, the baby has sort of a secure base. If anybody took psychology and remembers attachment theory, that's kind of this idea. So the baby can, interact with the caregiver and then explore the world. And this is what's really critical also about attachment theory. It's not only having a positive relationship, it's having a positive relationship that supports you to explore in the world. And then if the world gets a little scary, then come back and engage again in that positive relationship. And this positive relationship, it's been studied, primarily with moms. 90% still of the research on this in this area is with mothers, which I would say we need to include more caregivers in those studies. Anyway, so this is the idea of attachment, early relational health, exploration. Ooh, sorry, it's hot. And the other thing that I like to say, and this is again thinking more broadly than only moms, this like intense back and forth moms and babies, is that there are many opportunities to build relational health throughout the day, right? So if you're working with a kid, if you're feeding a kid lunch, if you're seeing a kid play on a sports team, this is a moment that we may not always have where we can like deeply debrief with a child, but when that moment is available, that's great. Oh, thank you. But so all of these sort of daily routines offer opportunities to build relational health. And then that really lays the groundwork for being able to then talk with kids about things that are challenging or hard. Okay. I also just put a little plug. Good for nutrition, good for physical activity, toothbrushing, oral health, all these good ways to promote family routines around health and also build in social emotional supports in those routines. And so the idea behind how we want to help children cope and drawing on that concept of what relational health can do is that relational health can really support children's safety and security. Like, do I feel safe? And again, reflecting on our own experiences, if people don't feel safe, they really can't take in additional information. And that is the primary need that we all have, is to feel safe and secure. Self-regulation is kind of like, can you control your behavior? Can you control your emotions? Can you control your thoughts, right? And again, thinking about a toddler who's like tired or needing to do something, and the goal is to like put the shoes on, right? Their self-regulation can just fall apart. So how do we kind of get them back? Self-reflection is another important component that can happen in a relationship with a caregiver. So, and I'll talk about some specific sort of techniques for this, but self-reflection is like, why am I feeling the way I'm feeling? Can I access my inner emotions, and can I then talk about them and think about them and distance them sort of from myself a little bit so I'm not overwhelmed by them. Traumatic experience integration, that idea is like, something happened to me that was not great. How do I kind of like manage that experience? And, integration is very psychodynamic, but it's like, how do I kind of move along with that, knowing that event happened to me, and I can still kind of go forward and have better things happen. I've talked about engagement and attachment. And the other really important thing is just having positive and restorative experiences. And so sometimes when I'm talking about this stuff, it's very heavy and dark. And it's also true that kids bring so much joy. And I think especially with young kids, it's often easy to access that joy, and remembering that accessing that joy for kids, for teens who sometimes hide that joy because they like to be surly or for whatever reason, it's important to get to, and it's actually really valuable to experience. And so the idea of sort of being silly, acting, I was in a meeting with a bunch of teachers yesterday, and the teacher was saying, yeah, one of the things we do in our classroom is we like flip the script so that one of the kids is the teacher and they imitate me. And I've been like, oh, I really do that, but the kids love it and they're laughing. And so it was like she engaged and brought this kind of positive, restorative kind of experience to them. Okay. Any thoughts, questions so far? And burning topics I haven't touched on quite yet. I'm happy to keep talking too. Thank you for opening the window. Okay, so what can we kind of do in our different roles in the ways we might interact with children and for children of different ages? And so I kind of have these like guiding principles that we can think about and just reflect on like how easy or hard this would be to do. But so thinking about children who've experienced difficult events, or maybe are scared about something on the news, or maybe, a parent is sick and you have to talk to a child about something, right? That's hard. So I think one of the really key things I talk about a lot is that we all as caregivers also need support. And certainly parents of young children who are just in the trenches every single day with those young children. Parents need support. And so thinking about, if you have the opportunity to be discussing a hard topic with a child, can it be in a planful way? Can it be in a way that you actually set aside the time and try to think about what supports do I need? Like if it's a topic like my spouse is really ill, I have to talk to my child to some degree about what we're going to do. Routines might change, for example. That's going to be really salient for young kids. How are your emotions doing in terms of this issue? How do you feel about talking about this issue with your family? And knowing that our stress can certainly affect our children. So setting aside time and having like a backup person too that you can go to is important, ideally. And then again, back to that need of like feeling safe and secure. That is sort of the number one thing, right? The child is safe, they're secure, and they're loved. So I think the other thing is that sometimes the child is not safe, right? Like it could be an emergent situation that is happening and you happen to be the person that is there with that child. And even something that's sort of small, like a child gets separated from their parent in a big busy place, right? Like that's a scary situation for a young child. I'm doing this and I'm like reflecting on the times that happened to my daughter, right? But you can reassure the child that you're safe, that they're safe, and that you're there as a resource for that child. Normalizing feelings, again, we talk about this a lot, but again, it can be really hard to do, especially being the caregiver of young children who have sometimes really big feelings. And so, again, especially if it's an event that the child is sort of new to the child, or the child is unfamiliar with what the implications of that event might be. Again, sort of thinking about like a sick parent. The child might have big feelings. The child might also have no feelings. And it's often true, and I don't know if people have had this experience, but like you gear up for a big conversation and the child's like, okay. And then you're like, wait, I was ready to have like half an hour of discussion, and they're like off. And so I think that's okay to take the cue to be like, okay, they're not ready for it now. And I think that they also just may not feel like sharing, and that's fine. The other thing is to elicit questions from the child and open up the topic for, do you have anything, anything you want to know? And it's okay to say, we don't know. And again, like one of these situations, like someone's going to the hospital and you don't know how long they're going to be there. But you can talk about that fact with the child. And again, one of the guidelines that we talk about a lot is not to provide a lot of extra information if the child isn't asking for it, and really let the child guide the conversation. It can be hard. You guys can tell I like to talk. So it can be hard to not talk and let the child drive the information that they want to know. But that's an important piece of it, and answer to the degree that is possible. And then the other thing, thinking about kind of building skills in general with kids, is relating this event to other experiences. Remember that time you had to wait for mommy to pick you up and she was late? What did you think then? How did you do, what made you feel better about that? What happened at the end? Sort of like play out smaller experiences to show the child and the parent and the caregiver that they got through it. What are some strategies you used? How did you feel afterwards? Were you okay? What was helpful? And so I think that's really important. Also, bigger picture things like, how do we calm our bodies down when we're feeling upset? Taking deep breaths, going on jumping for 5 minutes, doing creative work. And then the other thing, especially again, could be true for younger kids, also true for teens who have big worries a lot of the time. Even if you can't directly fix the situation, can you do something to act on behalf of it? And we talk about this too with like climate change, right? There's a lot of worry about climate change. An individual person really can't do a lot, right? But what can we do that is sort of can make us feel better and that we took action and give us like a little bit of agency, and especially again with teens, but even at a little kid level, this concept works. So thinking developmentally. The other thing, conversations will change as children grow. So like the kid who you'd set aside time to talk with and they were like, sure, and then they walked away. That could be their personality or their temperament, right? They're just not a talker. Could be that they're flooded and overwhelmed and they just can't handle talking about it right now. Could be that they didn't really understand the implications of what you said. I mean, it could be for lots of reasons. But for all of those reasons, we also know that these conversations are not kind of one-time discussions, and we need to like think about how we're going to return to this topic. Again, especially if it's something like a parent is going to have surgery. It's predictable amount of separation, hopefully. A parent is deployed. That's maybe it's definitely a longer time, perhaps unpredictable, right? And so how do we manage that like uncertainty and offer opportunities for kids to engage with us again about it? And then this is a really important issue, this idea of what we call like sleeper effects sometimes. So something happens over here, you think it's all resolved, and then 2 weeks later, there's a huge thing that is a behavioral response, and you go, oh, wow, that was out of the blue. And then you kind of like piece back the puzzle, and you're like, well, maybe that was related to what happened 2 weeks ago. And that is helpful, both for the parent or the caregiver experiencing that, but also for the child. You can be like, maybe you got so upset about this because, Sarah was really mean to you the other day. And remember how we talked about that a little bit, but maybe this other, mild thing happened that sort of, this experience was lurking and it kind of came out over here. The other example that I like to talk about with that, or just like checking all the reasons that you might attribute a behavior to, is like, especially thinking about toddlers, preschoolers, like, are they tired? Are they hungry? Is their shoe on wrong, right? Like these sort of like basic things that can really be hard to sometimes figure out. Okay, so thinking kind of moving towards teens also. As teens get older, problems may be more private, maybe bigger, maybe embarrassing, both to the teen and also to the caregiver. And so this is where I just feel like it's really important to remember to support caregivers of teens, because we can get, to some degree on board with supporting caregivers of young babies and toddlers and infants, right? But parents of teens, like their kids may be doing bad stuff, right, that we don't like, right, that is problematic. And so caregivers of teens, I think, really are in a hard place because they're both trying to manage their sort of changing child, but they also may be overwhelmed by the child's behaviors, maybe embarrassed to like share with their peer group. Oh gosh, so-and-so was bullying this kid on social media. It was my kid. I'm embarrassed to share that as a parent with my parent peer group, right? But the other thing is keep communicating with teens, even if they pretend like they're not hearing it, they're hearing something. And then that idea of being ready to be tested by teens, right? And again, like thinking about teens you may know or interactions you may have had with teens. They like to test, right? They like to test our limits, push our boundaries. And so it's important to kind of, again, have someone as much as possible to kind of debrief the situation with, right? And if it's a partner, that's great. If it's, if you and your partner disagree on how to handle it, maybe it's someone else, right? So like figuring out who in your network, in your parenting caregiver network, you can talk about this with, because teens can pose a lot of potential challenges. Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit more to the top bullet about supporting autonomy?
Oh, yeah. So in terms of where they are developmentally, like they just want to be able to do things themselves, solve problems themselves. Like they think their parents maybe or don't have a lot to offer in terms of advice, right? And again, thinking about social media, like parents grew up in a really different time from teens in terms of social media. And so that idea of like, I want to support you to solve this on your, not on your own, but I want to, what can I do that can be helpful to you, is I think a really important part of supporting teens' autonomy to go forward and be able to manage it. Does that make sense? Let's see. I wanted to talk a little bit about some other, I'll just kind of go through this a little bit quickly, but okay. I show this all the time, but this is just this idea of kind of the things that can affect kids, like I was talking about before, but also can affect us as caregivers, right? And so again, thinking about something big like climate change, this is something that can stress out a lot of us, right? And so that idea of, again, just like taking a moment for yourself before engaging around hard topics with kids is really important. So this is this idea of the ecological systems model or social ecological model. The child's kind of in the middle, here are all the caregivers. I think the other thing is that these sort of outer rungs can kind of bring in stress, but they can also bring in protective factors. And I think that's the other important part of sort of this big situating of child and family life, is that all of these things can kind of have positive and negative impacts. Socio-historical context. There was a really famous study by a sociologist named Glenn Elder who looked at children of the Great Depression. And depending on what age children were when they lived through the Great Depression was very related to sort of their future life outcomes. So for example, infants during the Great Depression and teens during the Great Depression had sort of worse physical outcomes over time because the infants were receiving kind of less nutrition, less high quality nutrition, and so it impeded their growth. Teens, back to that building autonomy piece, they were sort of constrained in what they could do, and they couldn't necessarily go out and get jobs because there were no jobs. And so those teens had sort of a less positive life trajectory because the Great Depression hit them in a way that was specific to their developmental stage. And so I bring that up because now we have, of course, COVID, which has been another context. And so all of this is to say that we also have this cohort of kids who have aged through COVID. And it's always important for us to keep in mind, what age was this child when we were sort of in the depth of COVID? Were they an infant? Were they a toddler? Were they at home with a parent who was having to work always on a screen and they weren't getting that sort of serve and return interaction? Were they in middle school? I had like a middle school and a high schooler in the depths of COVID. And I look at my, kids and I'm like, what did you kind of miss out on, thinking about where you were developmentally in COVID? And so I think when we talking with any kids, it's good for us to be able to reflect, like, how old was that kid during, 2020 to 2022, really? Not that we're not still in it in a lot of ways, but what was sort of in their developmental stage when the depths of COVID were happening. Okay, so this is this sort of social and emotional piece, and supporting parents. I'll skip through some of this because I want to show you guys some examples. But yeah, so this is like that, right? It's oh yes, right? There's so many, I have like subscriptions to all these photo things. I'm like, teen rolling eyes, right? We have been there. And right there too, so this is sort of like the joy and the challenge, right? And it changes across age. And I often reflect like this early childhood phase, physically exhausting, people are on your body all the time, you don't have a moment to yourself, like it's very challenging in that time, no time to self caregiver space. This is really a different stage, right? Like you may want to engage with the kids and they're not wanting to engage with you. And so it can be sort of this like readjustment, right, for parents and parenting. And just reiterating that point, we can all use support as our children grow. I don't know if people caught this headline, but the Surgeon General put out like an alert, an advisory that parents were under so much stress. It was a public health issue. And so it played in different ways in the media. People were like, parents have always been stressed. And people were like, no, parents are now under much more stress. And so I do think that parents are losing a lot of the supports that historically they might have had, and things like living far from your family of origin is a huge issue, right? Like I mentioned, I'm from California. Like I don't live near any grandparents, So this is something that's been noted. And so how do we kind of support parents, especially parents who are living under undue stress, so housing instability, food insecurity, et cetera, and who also may have had that in their personal history. And so sometimes when we have these events in our personal history, it is really hard when someone that we love gets hit by a hard event because it triggers a lot of those feelings in us. And so in early parenting, that's a really powerful point of intervention, that we work with parents who have a lot of stress in their own lives about how to kind of readjust and reparent and do it in different ways for like their infant. Talk about infant mental health. And so I've mentioned a few of these things, but this idea of provide parents with the support that they need so they can support kids, both material needs that I've talked about, and also social isolation, I think is a really, really, really critically challenging piece for parents. There's a lot of kind of connection online and a lot of social connection in that way, but the in-person social isolation is pretty real. Both for the parents of young kids like I've talked about, and also for parents of teens for other reasons. And then the other thing is that giving advice, but hopefully not misinformation, is important. Okay, and then so I want to make sure I give some resources that I like. And so speaking again about young kids, these are things that I've been involved with some consulting and stuff a little bit with PBS Kids, and I think that, in general, I think PBS Kids is great, but just to call people's attention, they have done some series that are called PBS Kids Talk About, and they're all sorts of things. They're sort of from a parent chronic illness, a parent who needs to be in a hospital, deployment. This was a race and racism segment. And I think they do a very thoughtful job. They do a very developmentally informed job. And so I think that would be a good place to kind of Google if something is coming up in the lives of kids that you know, and think like, where are some resources that have like dealt with this topic before, right? My child's family is moving. My child's family is losing their apartment. There's things in all of those topic areas, also Sesame Street. And then this is a great resource. I don't know if people know Lisa's work, but she is a great resource, I think, for managing older kids and teens and talking with them about hard things. She's actually a U of M grad from our psych program. And she just, like, I've known her since we were like 25 or whatever. But she has a very practical way of sort of summarizing strategies, hard things. Has started out with one book that was called Untangled about girls, and now she's kind of expanded. This one also has boys, and also has a podcast. So again, this is, I think, a really excellent resource for those with teens in our lives where we're like, I don't know how to talk to them. Are they dating people? Are they vaping? You know, we don't know, right? So lots of different resources there. And then I have these little videos that we have made for, maybe I'll skip over those for right now because they're kind of for preschool teachers, but I'm happy to share those in a second. But the other sort of topic I wanted to make sure to touch on is social media. And so this idea of resources for helping families manage social media in their lives and in their kids' lives. So this, we here at the University of Michigan have a Center for Excellence on Social Media, and it's run by some pediatrician colleagues. Jenny Radesky is someone who's really out in front of this work. And so this is just sort of thinking about guidance and guidelines for kids that you know who are using devices, which is all kids, and younger. So there have been some studies recently that have just sort of tried to get a sense of how young people are using devices. And kids who are under 5, it's something like 30% already have sort of a device that is sort of their device, and whether or not they have full control of it, but like, is there an iPad in the home that's like got the rubber bright green child dropping proof, you know, case on it? Like, that's that child's device, right? Even if they don't have total free rein on when to use it. So this is just something to kind of think about as guidance. And the idea is really like, you know, the other obvious place for device use is learning in school. And I'm saying devices, but you could also think about AI, because that is increasingly in school contexts and on devices. And so we've done some work around the apps, particularly educational apps that are kind of recommended. So I was just talking about PBS Kids, and PBS Kids is a good, solid, quality app. But there are a lot of apps out there that are marketed as learning apps, but they use a lot of the same attentional capture strategies that we all are used to. They use gamified strategies, so kids can do this and get points, and it keeps them going and it keeps them playing. I could talk about gambling too. You know, that's another thing that's coming up. And I actually had, last night, I think I saw some, it was like one of the gambling companies had sort of a kid app. I think it was FanDuel. Anyway, so keep an eye on this space. I think it's really important. And then this is something that I talk about around parenting and digital media. So like, understand reasons for the use of it. Understand it's really rewarding. It can also be really soothing. We can also be really soothed by our devices. It's an important emotion regulation strategy for us sometimes, a lot of the time. And then the other thing is that we hear a lot from advice to families is like, use the parent controls, and that makes sense. At the same time, we are never going to be able to stay ahead of kind of getting around controls or other kinds of use. And so that's really important to like give ourselves a break, because it's not an individual thing that we can control. It's really a structural or systemic thing that the kind of media companies are designing in order to keep our attention, right? So it's a very hard thing to sort of fight against individually. The other thing too is that things like co-viewing, movie watching, playing a game together, all of those things can promote that, like back to that emotional regulation and emotional health, relational health. All of those things can kind of be formed and promoted through shared media engagement. And so that's sort of, again, a positive element of media engagement. And I can stop there too, and have contact information. Answer any questions too.
Yeah, just I'll bring the mic, but first, just thank you so much, Dr. Miller. You've given us so much to think about, and I just want to encourage all my family members who are working with children to watch this. But back here, I know we had a quick question.
There was a special on NPR this morning about the use of digital. Using digital. Your phone or everything is in direct relation to how much you use it is how much the kids use it. They said it's that the kids probably know it's the adults the problem, that the adult, if you get off of yours, then they have a tendency not to use it so much.
Absolutely, and I haven't heard that study, so I'll check that out. But right, that we model, right? I mean, think about everything that kids model that we do. Absolutely, and it's such a compelling thing, right? We're so attuned, it can get our attention at any time, and so it's a really powerful thing to model. Think about like that classic, child wants to like shave like daddy, right? And those pictures, see little kids doing this. It's the same process, right? Absolutely. Yeah.
So much, thank you. So much to take in. I have a question about trauma in kids, and my grandkids, especially one of them, has seen a lot of trauma with their mother, and even though the trauma happened a year ago, I'm wondering if you have any advice. Like, how often do you need to revisit? Is it just guided by the child? This child is 10 now, so when the really bad stuff happened, he was 7, and then 9. 7 and 9, he's had real trauma. And I just don't know, as a grandmother, like I'm hearing from you, wait for him, he's the guide. But how long, as a parent or grandparent, should you expect to be working through this kind of stuff?
So I would say it's a wonderful question, and I'm sorry, it's a hard thing. It's going to keep like cropping up, right, at different points in development. So if something happened when you're 7, you like reach a different level of understanding of that thing when you hit 13, right? Or maybe new things happen in your social context when you're 13 that make you think and reframe maybe what happened when you were 7. So that's these developmental transition periods. Things kind of come out in different ways. And hopefully that there's this like cycle we talk about in trauma about kind of that's that reintegration part where you can resolve. But I think as a caregiver in the child's life, what I would say is, go by the child, but also maybe a little strategically open up opportunities for conversation about the topic and just checking in, and make it not stigmatizing to check in about it, but also if the child doesn't want to, then respecting that is.
Other questions or comments for Dr. Miller?
Yeah.
I can imagine that it's overwhelming for parents to navigate all of the media stuff by themselves, and I'm just wondering, and I'm maybe being Pollyanna, but is there any work being done to try and get laws passed at Congress? Is there lobbying going on to give parents some real supports by restricting what they can see?
I'm not sure if anybody else in the room knows the answer to that question specifically. I know yes. I do not know the specifics. There is my pediatrician colleague, Jenny Radeski, who's here at U of M, is really active in this. And a lot of it is trying to get this types of apps restricted by age, things like, posting an age restriction. Of course, we also know, right, you can just type in any birth date. As soon as kids can do math, it's a really good incentive to learn math, right, to give a false birth date to be able to get access. So it is very difficult. The other thing I will say, Jonathan Haidt, Haidt, he has this new book now called The Anxious Generation, and talks about, it's like the 4 new norms. One of them is like no phones in schools. One of them is no phones before 16. I don't think that's very realistic. I think also no phones in schools has to be done in an appropriate way, because there's a lot of reasons you need phones in schools, especially now that we don't have like front desk staff in schools who can be attentive to child needs or have a phone. But another one of the recommendations he makes, which again, Pollyanna-ish, I'm like, this sounds great, is like enlist your community and your friend, your child's peers' parents to all pledge that you won't do phones. And that sounds great. I think it is a lot to place on parents to do that. I think sometimes that can work for a bit, but then maybe your child starts doing a new sport and they get a whole new group of peers, and you have to do that with a bunch of additional parents while you're already being a parent. It just feels like too much to me. So I feel like it's an interesting discussion. It's certainly a discussion that is out there in our space currently, but I think the recommendations are a little simplistic. That's my opinion, but yeah.
Practically, do you have a recommendation on apps to allow parents to moderate what can and can't be seen? Just like the practicality of a particular app, because I know there's a lot out there. But
there are a lot that I don't. But actually, the Center for Excellence in Social Media Use, I think I have the name a little bit wrong, but I'm happy to share it over email. That would be a good place to look. So I think there's increasingly better guidance around that. My kids are out of the gate. They're 22 and 17 now. But it's hard, right? Because it also changes all the time. And I think that's the other thing. And they're always get-aroundable, but there are supports out there. So great question.
Any last, do we have time for maybe one more quick question or comment in the group? Okay. Well, hearing none.
Aww,
Dr. Miller, we have a little gift to thank you so much.
So beautiful.
Yeah, just
I love this.
A small gift.
I love this.
Yeah, and
Thank
we,
you so much.
I'm sure I speak for everyone. We really appreciated your presentation, and especially that you are also a parent. Kind of interject that lived experience. So thank you for that.
Sometimes it's really helpful to be a developmental psychologist when you're a parent. Sometimes like not at all. So it's a good reality check. But thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
And then just quickly, for those of you in the room and online, I just want to give a short plug for next week. We have Tara Shantz is going to be here. She's going to be talking about how to manage after a cancer diagnosis. I believe she speaks from personal experiences and has developed some resources for that. So any of you interested in that, please join us for that presentation. Thank you all.
Thank you. All right. This is great. Thank you.